The UN presents itself as a shining beacon of hope and global peace, yet thanks to a whistleblower, the dark side of their global cover-ups are being revealed. Let's talk about cover-ups. The American medical and insurance systems who won't tell their patients everything and have no trouble leaving you holding a bag filled with debt. And Marco Rubio seems to be taking the proverbial gloves off in his aim to be considered a solid choice for POTUS. The questions about his real motives will not be hard to shake. Shake off the rust and question everything. I'm Ed Berliner. This is MidPoint.
They were supposed to protect the weakest from the havoc of the civil war in the Central African Republic. But instead, some French soldiers sent there as peacekeepers are suspected of sexually exploiting minors while stationed there. That's what an internal UN report leaked to French authorities allegedly indicates. The report shows the children were severely traumatized by the events, and that the soldiers gave them small amounts of food, water, and sometimes some cash in return for sex.
Some 18 months ago, French military forces were sent to the Central African Republic, charged with putting an end to the violence between Christian militias and the Muslim rebels that had seized power by force. Instead of saving, there are nagging accusations that these peacekeepers were involved in the sexual abuse of children at a refugee camp, something the United Nations is allegedly doing all they can to ensure never reaches the light of day. Our guest is a former investigator for the UN Office of Internal Oversight Services who believes there is a cover-up culture at the UN involving potential criminality such as this. Let's welcome Peter Gallo to MidPoint. Peter, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Ed.
Peter, just for full disclosure, you are no longer working at the United Nations at the present time, and you are involved in a lawsuit claiming defamation against one of your superiors there, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. We want to then dig into what you then saw and what you then are able to tell us, because when we hear stories like these, the people who look at the United Nations always look at them as an organization that is there for the good of those people that they serve. Yet this and so many other issues seem to be covered up by the UN as conveniently and as quickly as they possibly can. Did you always see some sort of evidence of this during your time there?
In my experience, I would say that there's certainly a desire not to report misconduct where it's identified. And the organization benefits greatly from reports that go nowhere, reports that find that the allegations were unsubstantiated, and if there's an excuse to close an investigation, it will be taken.
With regard to the French situation that we're talking about, the French troop accusations, these are heinous accusations, if indeed they are true. At this level of accusation, this level of criminality that goes on, did you see further evidence of that and the UN perhaps trying to protect people during your time there?
The allegations which have arisen in this case are every bit as bad as the worst of the sexual exploitation and abuse cases as have arisen in the past. The difference in this case is that it was known and it has become known that the UN has failed to pass the information on and has failed to do anything for a considerable time in order to give the French authorities something that they can in fact act on. The only interest that the UN had was in taking action against the official, who was Mr. Compass, who actually provided the information to the French authorities.
Now, when you talk about the individual who has provided all this information to the authorities here, is he protected, and if so, by whom?
No, he's not protected. He's not protected because by the very narrow definition of whistleblower protection in the United Nations, first he would have to have made a complaint of misconduct himself, and he didn't do that. And secondly, even if he had, the whistleblower protection in the United Nations, as has been recently established in an appeals tribunal judgment last year, is in fact discretionary. So there is no right to whistleblower protection. It is optional.
With regard to a lot of these other instances that happen there has to be a code of conduct at the United Nations, is there not, when they see something like this in order to bring it to the fore and at least investigate it, to look into it? Don't they do something like that already?
Well, there's more than a code of conduct, Ed. It's actually in the staff rules. If a United Nations staff member is aware of misconduct of any form, he's under an affirmative duty to report it. The only problem is that the staff know that by doing so, they can in fact be committing career suicide because the protections are simply non-existent. As I said, the whistleblower protection is not a right, it's an option. And the retaliation is commonplace. The question you have to ask is, why would any staff member willingly expose himself and expose his career to that kind of risk?
Is there pressure then from the hierarchy at the United Nations? Because, of course, you talk about the fact that this commits career suicide for those people to bring it up. But is there constant pressure then from the people above to make sure that these things, these investigations, these incidents are kept down?
I believe there is, yeah. I believe there are mechanisms in place. I believe that there are key people put in key positions specifically in order to ensure that things are downplayed, covered up, and filed in the wastepaper basket rather than actually get as far as being investigated.
Why do they then call them misconduct first instead of just going into a full-blown investigation? It would seem that at that point they're almost trying to minimize and continue to hide this right from the very beginning.
You're touching on an interesting point. Misconduct covers a multitude of sins. It can cover something as minor as a breach of the staff rules. It could cover something as minor and insignificant really as parking in the Secretary General's car parking space, and it goes all the way through the spectrum to rape and other serious offences. The UN only has jurisdiction to investigate their own staff and can only do that under the rules. If there is a situation where a staff member has committed a criminal offence, as you would have in the case of a serious sexual assault or a rape, that has to be investigated criminally. The United Nations can't throw anybody in jail for something. They simply don't have the powers to do so. All they can do is refer that to the national authorities of the country where the offence took place and leave the local police to deal with it and leave the local criminal justice system to hand someone over for prosecution.
The world is, of course, looking at what's happened here in this discussion of the Central African Republic, boys as young as 9 years old, luring them with army rations, small change when their families had nothing to feed them. I mean, this is despicable in itself. Do you have the opinion that this is just the tip of an iceberg here for the United Nations, that indeed there are so many other incidents around the world that they are covering up to this day?
Probably not. The instance of sexual abuse and exploitation cases like this, the incidents are actually very low. However, you've got to understand that UN personnel, if you like, scattered around the world, fall under two categories. The first are blue helmet peacekeeping troops. Now, those are troops provided by troop contributing countries. The UN does not have any direct jurisdiction over them. If someone is a soldier in the Turkish army or the Greek army or anything on UN peacekeeping duties, his national army maintains responsibility for him. If he does something wrong, he'll be court-martialed under his national system. If an offence is committed by a soldier on peacekeeping duties, if it's reported to the UN, the only thing the UN can do is refer it back to the national authorities. Now, in some cases, the country will request the UN to carry out a joint investigation, and they'll do that for the reasons of transparency. If, however, the perpetrator is not a soldier, but the perpetrator is a civilian staff member, the UN has exclusive jurisdiction, and there's no obstacle to that.
I do want to point this out, 45 seconds left. A campaign that was launched yesterday called Code Blue to end immunity for UN personnel in cases of sexual exploitation or abuse. Do you think that goes far enough?
No. I support the campaign wholeheartedly, but my point is I don't believe that the immunity should be waived solely on grounds of immunity for sexual offences. I think it has to be waived in terms of all criminal offences, particularly in fraud, financial crime, corruption, embezzlement, and any other crimes that are being perpetrated by UN staff members in which the UN system is failing to investigate.
Peter, the system indeed is something that needs to be looked at. It's a shame that you're not there to continue to do it, but hopefully we'll continue to follow this case here and at least see if someone is going to hold the proper people responsible as well. Peter Gallo, thanks so much for bringing this to our attention. I'm sure we'll talk again.
Thank you, Ed.
All right, my pleasure. Coming up next, when we talk about cover-ups here, what about back home when it comes down to American health insurance and what they don't tell you? A personal story from one of our own right here on MidPoint.